Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, Episode 95, Algirdas. So, we've covered Ivan and Ozbek's successors, and now we need to fill in what's been happening in Lithuania after Gediminas. When Gediminas died, Lithuania faced the same kind of problems that we've already seen other kingdoms going through. It had rapidly expanded, and although it had made some steps towards establishing the institutions needed to rule these new possessions, it had not yet figured out how best to deal with inheritance and succession. Gediminas had 7 sons, and he divided his lands among them, which is not usually a recipe for success. But unless a society has developed an expectation that one son should inherit, it's what happens. We have a clear picture of how the lands were allocated, but we do not fully understand the reasoning behind his decisions. For instance, he gave his middle son, Jaunotis, the title of Grand Duke of Lithuania and the capital city of Vilnius, while Trakai and Žemaitija, also a Grand Duchy and together forming the Lithuanian core, went to Kęstutis. We have no indication why the middle son, rather than the oldest or youngest, was chosen, although historians have to assume that it was based on some kind of principle. The eldest son, Manvidas, received Kernave and Slonim. Narimantas received Pinsk. Algirdas received Kreva and Vitebsk, where he already ruled thanks to marrying into the previous knyaz's family. Karyotis Mikhail got Novokrudak. If you recall, Lyubatas had already been set up in Vladimir in Volhynia earlier, and he did not receive any additional allocations. I should note that Narimantas had previously been knyaz in Polotsk, and we do not have any record of how he lost this position. So, 2 of the sons got Lithuanian lands, 2 of them got a mix of Lithuanian and Rus lands, and 2 sons got Rus lands only. The usual explanation for this is that Gediminas was avoiding breaking up the 2 Lithuanian Grand Duchies, which were the core of his realm, and that the allocation of frontier zones was intended to encourage further expansion. In the later years of his life, Narimantas and Algirdas had played the biggest role alongside Gediminas, so historians have wondered why the most important land and titles went to Jaunotis and Kęstutis. We don't really have any indication of why. Historians have given us their best guesses and theories. Some have argued that Jaunotis might just have been the favourite son, others that Gediminas was concerned about the rivalry between Narimantas and Algirdas and wanted to avoid a civil war, which may also be linked to Narimantas losing Polotsk. But we can't say for sure. Among the brothers, Jaunotis is reputed to have been close to Narimantas and Kęstutis to Algirdas. But when all's said and done, as we've seen before in other times and places, it essentially came down to Gediminas making an arrangement that would stand or fall based on whether the brothers were willing to accept it and cooperate with each other. And brotherly cooperation can rarely be relied on. Luckily, Moscow and the Horde were also going through their own problems, as we've heard, and the Order was also suffering the poor administration of one of its least competent Grand Masters. So Lithuania managed to avoid any serious long-term effects from Jaunutis being what historian S.C. Powell calls a pathetic interlude between strong national heroes, his father and his brother Algirdas. The chronicle for this period records Algirdas and Kiestutis defending Pskov against the knights. Although Algirdas himself refused the people's request to convert, his son was baptized as Andrei and became Knyaz of Pskov. In 1343, the two brothers team up again to attack Livonia, where there was another local uprising against the Order. This campaign provokes a counterattack by the knights, which is a complete failure, and results in the resignation of the Grand Master. While we hear a fair amount about what these two brothers are doing, the chronicles don't tell us anything about Jaunutis. We have to assume that he was not doing very much. The consensus among historians is that after a few years of this, Algirdas and Kiestutis, as the more ambitious and dynamic brothers, eventually decided that it was not reasonable for them to have a weaker and younger brother as their overlord. So they removed him. The coup took place during the 1345 campaign season. The coup took place during the 1345 campaign season. Algirdas was raiding Livonia, but the chronicles agree that it was his planning behind the coup. Kiestutis seized Jaunutis and took control of Vilnius, forcing the citizens to swear allegiance to the new regime. Then he summoned his elder brother to take charge. Meanwhile, Jaunutis escaped and fled to his brother-in-law, Simeon of Moscow. Simeon was happy to baptize him into orthodoxy, but Jaunutis' sister, Augusta, had passed away a few months earlier, and Simeon was looking for a new wife. Moscow was not willing to help him retake Vilnius. Jaunutis' ally among the brothers, Narimantas, fled to Janibek, where he was likewise welcomed, but provided with no assistance. The other brothers all accepted Algirdas as the new Grand Duke, which he will remain until 1377. The fact that neither brother sought assistance from the Order, which we will see in later cases, is evidence of just how bad things were in Marienbad at this time. Gediminas' attempt to solve the conundrum of his sons' relations with each other had failed, but it was not a complete disaster. 2 years later, Jaunutis returned to Lithuania, submitted to his brother, and was given new lands at Zaslavl. Soon after, Narimantas also returned, also submitted, and resumed his rule of the lands that he had been allocated. They both became important supporters of Algirdas, witnessed his charters, and led his armies on important campaigns. Civil war among the brothers had been avoided after all, and the succession had been resolved. I mentioned a while back, but it's worth noting again, that I have been referring to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Grand Dukes up to now out of convenience and convention. Algirdas was the first to actually claim that title, which most historians agree he did as a declaration of opposing himself to Moscow as the new overlord of the old Rus Kняжество. Algirdas did indeed continue the expansion of the Lithuanians east and south, and he found himself in particularly favourable conditions to do so. His reign coincided with the Teutonic Order experiencing a period of weakness and disorganisation, as well as the severe reduction in crusaders caused by the Black Death. Lithuania proper seems to have largely escaped the Black Death itself, probably protected by the same remoteness and inaccessibility that had helped to defend it since the beginning. In the east, Moscow was still only finding its feet. Simeon was a worthy opponent, but then Ivan II was an ineffective ruler, and he was succeeded by a 9-year-old child. Algirdas pushed Lithuanian control to within 150 kilometers of Moscow, and even marched against the city itself on 3 occasions, although never successfully. However, despite strong support, Lithuania never managed to bring Novgorod fully under its influence, and its attempt to build an alliance with Tver and block Moscow's rise failed. Algirdas continued the efforts to divide the Orthodox Church and establish a separate metropolitanate under Lithuanian control. He wrote to the Patriarch, claiming to have authority over Kiev, Smolensk, Novosil, and Nizhny Novgorod. However, these efforts were once again thwarted by the Metropolitan in Moscow. Some historians have blamed this failure on Algirdas' own failure to convert. Like his father, he remained a pagan and used his adherence to tradition and promises of concessions or conversion to balance the interests of his Lithuanian and Orthodox subjects, and for international diplomacy with his Latin Christian neighbours. It was not a simple choice. Algirdas ruled many more Orthodox Slavs than Lithuanian pagans. Conversion could have completely upended the structure of power. Conversion to Orthodoxy would also have had a different effect on the Northern Crusades than a conversion to Latin Christianity. As we've heard, the Knights treated the Orthodox as schismatics worse than actual pagans. A conversion to Orthodoxy would not have been an argument for ending the Crusades and reaching a peace agreement. What would have happened if he had converted to Orthodoxy remains one of those big what-if questions of history. When Algirdas became Grand Duke, Lithuania was more powerful and in a better position for development than Moscow. By the time the Grand Dukes actually converted, Moscow was considerably stronger. Lithuania was also in a good position relative to the Horde, which was struggling to recover from the Black Death and would soon fall into the civil wars of the anarchy. Although it was sometimes in conflict with the Horde's vassals, Lithuania was also sometimes the Horde's ally against other enemies. Added to this, although we have discussed the problems with the idea of peaceful Lithuanian annexations of Rus Kняжество before, by this point, Lithuania was well established in Ruthenian territories, and several kняжества were now ruled by Lithuanian nobles, who had married daughters of knyazes and been baptized into Orthodoxy. This meant that this kind of expansion was now becoming a realistic option. Despite the favorable conditions, the expansion was intentional rather than opportunistic. In a letter to the Teutonic Order, Algirdas declared that the whole of Rus should belong to Lithuania. Although historians continue to debate what that actually meant to him, whatever the answer was, he took personal responsibility for campaigns in this direction. For the West and for defences against the Knights, he relied on Kęstutis. The early part of Algirdas' reign saw significant development in Galicia-Volhynia. As we've discussed previously, Lithuania and Poland had both become involved in Galicia-Volhynia following the extinction of the Rurikid line of knyazes. Algirdas' brother, Liubartas, who would enjoy a very long career, was the predominant force in Volhynia, while the Polish Bolesław Yuri had ruled in Galicia. When Bolesław Yuri died in 1340, a boyar oligarchy led by a Dmytro Dietko had followed him. Dietko successfully found a middle ground between Lithuania and Poland that made him acceptable to both. But this seems to have been based purely on personal relations and did not establish a new system of rule in Galicia. When Dietko died in 1349, Kazimierz III of Poland launched a large-scale military campaign that occupied Lviv and Halych and imposed direct royal control on Red Ruthenia. Officials and garrisons were installed, and the territory was administratively incorporated into Poland. While Lithuania might have been willing to let Poland take Galicia, the Poles had also partially occupied Liubartas' land in Volhynia, and that was another matter. Lithuanian forces assisted the Volhynians in pushing the Poles back into Galicia. Kazimierz turned to Hungary for assistance. You'll remember that both Poland and Hungary had intervened in Galicia numerous times and had claims of varying legitimacy. Members who have listened to the Poland episodes will also know that Kazimierz had no legitimate son and had made his sister's son, Louis I of Hungary, his heir. This meant that Louis had an interest in supporting Kazimierz' expansionism. The two signed an agreement in 1350 that reaffirmed that Louis would inherit Poland and Galicia if Kazimierz died without a son, and it further provided that if Kazimierz did provide an heir, Louis would receive monetary compensation. So, for Louis, Hungarian participation in the campaign was an investment. The result was that Hungary joined Poland's Galician campaign against the Lithuanians in 1351. When Kazimierz was incapacitated, Louis took personal command of the armies. On the Lithuanian side, Kęstutis, who had command of the west, joined Algirdas in the defence of Volhynia. The Hungarian army enjoyed early success, moving deep into Kęstutis' territory. In August, Kęstutis begged for negotiations and agreed to accept baptism and submit to the King of Hungary. The Hungarians withdrew, and Kęstutis reneged on his agreement. Sometime during this campaign, Algirdas was captured, but was subsequently released. Frustratingly, although all sources agree on this, we do not know where he was captured, when, or by whom, and we do not know why he was released. In 1352, the Polish-Hungarian forces returned, laying siege to Bielsk, which was forced to surrender, and other towns in Volhynia. At the same time, a force from the Horde, including Rus soldiers, raided Poland and maybe captured Lublin. While we do not have conclusive evidence, it appears that this was coordinated with the Lithuanians. The Poles were forced to abandon Bielsk and return to their home territory. It was becoming clear that taking any part of Volhynia would require vastly more effort than Galicia. So a truce was agreed, with Galicia under Polish control and Algirdas retaining Volhynia. However, this was more by way of recognizing how things stood practically than an agreement on who owned what. The following year, it was Lithuania's turn to attack, bringing a large force against Lviv and raiding Halych, while another Horde army raided Lesser Poland. The conflict looked like it could escalate into a broader regional war, but instead the parties pulled back to minor skirmishing and stepped up efforts towards a diplomatic resolution. Meanwhile, Poland continued administrative reforms in Galicia. Lviv was given a charter under Magdeburg law and large land grants. German colonists were moved to settle in the region. The changes in governance were intended to fully integrate Galicia as a Polish province. In 1356, a peace agreement was finally concluded, with a declaration that it would apply for 10 years. Ending the conflict with each other did not mean a full peace arrived in the region. Algirdas continued to pursue his aim of acquiring all of Rus, moving south into Podylia as the anarchy broke out in the Horde and its control over the Dnieper region weakened. However, Poland also had an interest in expanding its territory from Galicia into Podylia, and in 1364, Kazimierz abandoned the peace agreement and launched a new military campaign into Volhynia. This campaign was Poland's most successful yet, capturing Holm, Bielsk, and Vladimir in Volhynia. This led to a new peace treaty, this time with the formal division and diplomatic recognition of each other's territory. Galicia remained Polish, later becoming part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and then the Austrian Empire. Poland also received some of Volhynia and Podylia, while eastern Volhynia remained Lithuanian under the rule of Algirdas. It might seem a bit strange that the Lithuanians apparently looked for the Horde's assistance against the Poles but almost at the same time were annexing Rus vassals of the Horde, which sometimes meant fighting the Horde as well. However, both the Lithuanians and the Horde were very pragmatic in their approach to these situations. The Horde were quite willing to recognize a Lithuanian knyaz taking over, even issuing jarliks, if the Lithuanians continued to pay tribute. For their part, the Lithuanians were willing to pay tribute and to supply troops when asked, as long as they could act as if they were independent rather than vassals of the Mongols. Some of the acquisitions were more by a combination of threat and the offer of a dynastic alliance than by direct force. Algirdas had at least 20 legitimate children from his 2 marriages, both of which were to Orthodox Rus women, Maria of Vitebsk and Uliana of Tver. Most of them were baptized and had Slavic names, and ended up ruling Kняжество under Lithuania. Vitebsk, Bransk, Novhorod-Siversky, Kyiv, Pinsk, as well as Volhynia and Podylia had Lithuanian rulers. They supplied tribute and troops to the Grand Duke, but it was not a unitary state. As Darius Baronas and S.C. Rowell describe it, quote, "In pagan times, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania represented a conglomerate of lands that, except for the ruling dynasty, had very little in common." End quote. Later chronicles, particularly the Hustinska Chronicle from the 17th century, claimed that Algirdas himself converted to Orthodoxy before his first marriage. This could have been quite normal, as Christians were generally highly averse to giving their daughters to non-believers. However, we do not have any contemporary evidence to support this. In contrast, we do know that he had a pagan burial. But that is still ahead of us, and we will be seeing more of Algirdas over the next couple of decades of our story. Thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.